So, Robert Baratheon was probably always on borrowed time as king. He was not very good at his job, and when Jon Arryn died and Ned replaced him as Hand of the King, it truly exposed how terrible of a ruler Robert really was. So, the very first domino to fall in A Game of Thrones is with the death of Jon Arryn, and as we move forward in this story, we learn that the king, Robert Baratheon, was hyper-dependent on his hand, Jon Arryn, and when Jon Arryn died, replacing him with someone he has trusted for the position truly left Robert with only one candidate in his mind for replacement, and that is Eddard Stark, aka Ned Stark. It's easy to see that without Robert participating as ruler, so many plots and schemes were allowed to develop directly under his nose. Now, I would argue that the greatest conflict in Robert's reign as king was actually not until the current events told in A Game of Thrones, when tensions between the Starks and Lannisters begin to grow. The Lannisters are justified in their grievance that Tyrion has been abducted by Catelyn Stark, and Tywin, Jaime, and Cersei all actually have no idea why this has happened. Although Catelyn makes the claim that Tyrion conspired to murder her son, we have nothing in the books that suggests this accusation was made public to anyone outside the inn at the Crossroads, which I think is kind of hard to believe, but there's no mention from anyone that suggests they know why Catelyn abducted Tyrion. And of course, the reasoning for Tyrion's abduction is kept secret from Robert, and here's the problem with Robert not being a participant in his small council meetings or truly anything politically. He simply does not ask questions, and nobody seems comfortable in sharing with Robert their suspicions. Both Ned Stark and Stannis Baratheon refuse to share the conspiracies with Robert that are being committed by Cersei. Ned refuses to share the information that Lysa Arryn had shared in a letter to Catelyn. So I believe Robert creates a lot of problems due to the fact that nobody seems to trust him, at least not enough to share their suspicions. A lot of fans may focus on Ned's unwillingness to discuss the legitimacy of Robert's children without any proof, and Ned is also sure that Robert would kill Cersei and the children if he found out the truth. So with that, it may be more understandable to keep the truth from Robert, but one issue that speaks volumes is that Ned refuses to share anything about his investigation into Jon Arryn's death. One revolving theme between many characters is a total lack of communication, and it poses a lot of questions about Ned and Robert's relationship. Quite simply, Ned does not trust Robert, and this isn't so much as a development that occurs in the first book, but rather something that probably stems all the way back to Robert's rebellion and the sacking of King's Landing, the murder of Elia Martell, as well as her children, with Rhaegar Targaryen being brutally murdered by Lannister bannermen. I think the murder of innocent children is something Ned has held with him since the rebellion. It's fair to say that Ned's relationship with Robert is complicated, but even with the lack of trust between the two, Robert still refers to Ned as quote-unquote the brother he chose, and I think this suggests that Robert may be ignorant to much of Ned's distrust of him. Now, the issue about trust is one thing, but strategically, we know that keeping everything secret from Robert did not serve Ned well at all. Now, what would have happened had Ned shared with Robert the information provided by Lysa Arryn? I believe it would have really put Robert's feet to the fire to finally act as a king to come to a resolution of this potential conflict. The issue with my thinking here is to assume Ned could have confessed the full story to Robert, but the best opportunity Ned has given to share with Robert everything is after Ned and Jaime's altercation. In Eddard 10 in A Game of Thrones, Ned is recovering from the injury to his leg when he is visited by Robert and Cersei. The last 2 pages of this chapter are incredibly interesting and very carefully written by George R. R. Martin, I think. If your thinking is anything like mine, I almost look at Ned's inability to tell Robert the truth as a plot hole. But this chapter, at least the end of this chapter, is what truly challenges me on this, and it's the level of Robert's stubbornness and seemingly intentional oblivion. I'm going to go ahead and put these last 2 pages of Eddard 10 here on the screen so you can reference it for context of what I'm about to say. There's a ton here. Ned tells Robert that he was visiting Bara, a bastard girl fathered by King Robert. Ned requests to leave to seek out Jaime Lannister and bring him back to King's Landing for justice, and Ned also states that Catelyn has taken Tyrion captive at his own command. If you're Robert, think about this. Your hand, as well as the quote-unquote brother you chose, has been visiting brothels to meet with a woman who has given birth to your bastard. Ned has commanded the kidnapping of your brother by law in Tyrion, and has had a violent confrontation with your other brother by law and Kingsguard, Jaime Lannister. Again, if you're Robert, running away to go hunt is probably the very last thing you should be doing right now. Robert's stubbornness here is almost unbelievable, and by stubbornness, I should probably be saying denial. Robert is denying the conflict that is growing between his wife's family and his hand. Ned says, "We must talk," and Robert refuses him and states they'll talk when he returns from his hunt. While obviously neither of them realize that this is truly the last chance they have to basically prevent all-out war, but this isn't just crazy in hindsight. This is Robert deliberately neglecting the realm, and a really good indicator of the type of ruler Robert truly was. But while Robert isn't willing to confront the significance of the situation, Ned doesn't insist on this either. He lets it go. Granted, he's recovering from an injury and he's clouded from milk of the poppy, but don't forget, at this time, Ned truly believes that the Lannisters have tried to kill his son. I'm saying to myself, Ned, please, just utter some sort of words. Once they're said, Robert will have a reaction, and unless Ned trusts Robert so little that he thinks Robert would side with the Lannisters or refuse to demand a trial of some sort, it's unclear what Ned believes would be the consequence of explaining the conflict with the Lannisters. Why is everything kept a secret? What would Robert do? Does Ned believe that Robert would side with the Lannisters, and by default, that would make him oppose the Riverlands, the Vale, and of course the North? Now, in fairness to Ned, I do believe that he believes that a conversation with Robert when he returns from his hunt will occur, and they'll get all of the cards out on the table. My problem with Ned's thinking here is that Ned is far more careful to confide in his friend Robert, while comparatively, he is much more open and comfortable with the dialogue that he has with Littlefinger and Varys. Two characters he certainly doesn't trust, and he has no history of childhood bond with either of them. So I don't really understand why there's such a reluctance towards Robert when there's all this openness with other characters. It's baffling that things have gotten this far without Ned opening up to Robert about Lysa Arryn's letter, or the attempted attack on Bran by the Catspaw, or the investigation, though, just in general, of everything else that he's doing, everything else that he's thinking. Think about this. Robert doesn't even know that somebody tried to kill Bran in his sleep. I think that that's something Ned should open up to his king about. Again, I do believe Ned intended to share with Robert all of this information once Robert returned from the hunt, but delaying this conversation due to a lack of trust and openness will ultimately cost Ned everything, including his life. Now, a lot of people look at Ned's strategy as hand and say that he was stupid or naive, and I understand that. But what truly gets Ned in over his head is that the level of treachery and low cunning that occurs in King's Landing absolutely blindsided him. And if I wanted to justify Ned's hesitancy to be open with Robert, I'd point to this culture shock that Ned seems to be experiencing. And he sees Robert as the king who oversees this entire realm, and here in the capital, all hell seems to be breaking loose under Robert's rule. So if there's a reason of Ned's distrust, I say it's that Robert has allowed this environment. What's to say Robert is not just as corrupted? And if it is only due to neglect of his kingly duties, Robert is still responsible for every action he does or does not take, and he had no interest in being a ruler. I don't think it's a hot take to say Robert was a bad king. And with all of Ned's nobility and honor, as well as his commitment to service of the realm, Ned was just still simply in over his head and truly wasn't qualified for the position, which is a greater indictment of Robert as a ruler, that he chose Ned to be a politician, and there's nothing in any of the book material that suggests Ned would be the right person for this job. There's certain lines Ned is unwilling to cross that being Hand of the King requires you to cross. Unfortunately, Robert chose him as an emotional comfort blanket almost. While many people look at Ned as awful at playing the Game of Thrones, this all truly falls back on Robert. His neglect of attending the small council meetings and really just truly participating in his own rulership, with Jon Arryn gone, It made chaos almost inevitable. Perhaps we don't get the War of the Five Kings, but the mostly peaceful times between the end of Robert's rebellion and the present were at an end the moment Jon Arryn died.